That's where, you can go through a home and if you see a moisture stain in the ceiling, what does that tell you?
Nothing.
Right. It's really hard to tell you. I mean, how old's the home? If it's a 1-year-old home, something happened recently. If it's a 50-year-old home, that could have happened 50 years ago. Is there plumbing above there? Is your roof above there? Like people don't even realize there's big moisture stains in ceilings from mice sometimes. There's no leak, there's no condensation issue. It's mice going to the bathroom in a ceiling. And they're like, oh, there must be a leak here. Like they just had the roof replaced. I got to get my roofer back. And I'm like, no, you got a mouse issue in the house. Well, these are things that you can't tell without, like, if I went into the attic and I saw, the insulation's all been moved around by squirrels or mice or raccoons. Okay, that might be causing this issue and not a roof leak.
Welcome to Supply and Demand with Adam Nadler. This is a podcast dedicated to the real estate market in Canada, available now on YouTube, Apple Music, and Spotify. Kyle, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast. Tell us a little bit about what you do.
I'm a home inspector. My wife Rena and I, we own the York Region territory of the Pillar to Post home inspector franchise. And we are the ones that you send into a house to let you know the condition of what you are buying or selling.
Most of the time in Toronto, we have a really tough time getting a condition to get you guys in there.
Yeah.
Um, I guess my first question would be for people who are new to home buying or just haven't done it in a while, if you were a buyer or you were advising somebody as a buyer going into a home without any of the gadgets, what would you tell them to keep an eye out for? What are little tips and tricks that they could use to kind of check out a home?
Yeah. So if you're a buyer, a newer buyer, even newer or experienced, there are a lot of things you can look at with very little knowledge. You might have to look a few things up online, but yeah, there's a number of little tips and tricks that, as we've discussed before, like I kind of do naturally, don't even think about it, and these are things that a lot of people don't even know about homes. Um, as a new buyer, I mean, I'd always recommend if you can get it in there to get a home inspection done, obviously. But yeah, when you're walking through a home, if you're going to go see 5 homes in a day, um, you know, a real estate agent like you can probably pull up the age of a home. But a really easy trick that some people don't know about is when you're on the street, you can look at the sewer grates. They're almost always accurate within a year or two of the age of the home. So that can give you a starting point on what type of a home you're walking into. A home that's brand new renovated, you may have no idea the age of the actual home when it's freshly renovated because everything looks new. But the systems and the structures and stuff are going to be quite differing ages and conditions underneath. So yeah, checking the sewer grate, it's almost always just printed right on there the year of the home. I consider a home from the 1980s and newer, kind of a newer house. That's when building code really changed for the better in Ontario. So, if you're older than that, you're really going to want to be thinking about getting a home inspection done already. Houses built in the 70s, they had a lot of ventilation and electrical issues. Before that, a whole host of other issues. So the 80s and on, you're into the kind of the newer age of building code. When you're standing outside of a house, first thing I always look at as a home inspector is the roof. When you're on the road, usually you can see at least part of the roof. And it doesn't take, if the shingles are all still lying flat, you don't see any obvious deterioration. There may be no immediate need to do that, but sometimes it's very obvious from the road. You can see shingles falling off, curled shingles. You're going to know that roof probably needs to be replaced. If part of the roof is deteriorated, the whole roof is most likely going to be replaced. Now, that's something when you're not experienced, sometimes one side of the roof can look perfectly good. It's usually the south and the west slopes that deteriorate first. So you kind of got to know a little bit about that. You may look at the roof and say, oh, this looks good, but you can definitely tell if a roof looks bad, even without experience. And, that's again something you can Google deteriorated shingles, and you'll kind of know what you're going to be looking for there. Again, on the outside, the siding. If you're in an old neighborhood with old brick, check for chipped bricks, flaking bricks, deteriorated mortar. Doesn't take a genius to know if you look at the side of a brick wall and there's mortar with gaps that are this big and loose and crooked bricks, it's going to need some repairs. Same thing with siding, like wood siding, even vinyl siding. If it's loose, falling off, rotted, These are little things just on a quick scan around the house. If you're not sure, it's probably okay. Like it may need a closer look. Like everything I'm going to tell you probably should have a closer look, but the untrained eye, if something's really deteriorated, you can know pretty easily. Foundation. Every home is going to have a few foundation cracks, but if you see a crack that you could fit like a coin sideways through, that's going to be a leak hazard for sure. If it's bigger than that, it could mean structural concerns also. Again, it takes experience and training to know the implications of certain cracks on a home. But that's a general rule of thumb. If you can fit a coin in there, like water can easily get through there and probably needs waterproofing. Also, if you see a big crack, a big or a small crack, that's something you can keep in mind in your own head when you're in the basement. Check that area out and see if there's any moisture stains. If the basement's fully finished, you're not going to be able to see the crack, but you might be able to look at the drywall there and see if there's any moisture issues or flooring issues there as well. And another big one, landscaping. If the grading is sloping significantly towards one side of the house, it may be okay. They may have done waterproofing underneath there against the foundation, but again, it's something else. You can, okay, everything slopes towards the back wall of the house. When I go in the basement, I'm just going to check on that wall and see if there's anything that looks obvious for moisture issues down there. And you can move into the house. Moving inside, windows is a good one, as you mentioned earlier. You can check in between the window panes. Most double pane glass has a print inside and it will tell you the date. It can be hard to decode sometimes if you're not familiar with it, but usually you'll see that, 09-02-99. So like 99 is your year of the windows. So this year that'd be a 23-year-old window. Depends on the style of window if that would need to be replaced or not. And that takes experience. But, if you see 2018, you got new windows. If you see something that's like 40 years old, be budgeting to replace those, even if they don't look like they're deteriorated or leaking. That's another thing with bathrooms. You walk into a bathroom. If I see a bathroom that I know it looks really old, you got this old tile, old metal tub, really old looking fixtures. Even if they're not leaking when I inspect them, I'm going to recommend to probably replace those in the near future. The general rule of thumb, every 10 years or so, plumbing fixtures should be upgraded because gaskets start to leak and crack, even if the rest of the fixture is still working properly. So when you have an old bathroom, even if I inspect it and I don't find any leaks at the time of inspection, there's a good chance that those things could start to leak soon, even if they've been well maintained. So an old bathroom is almost always a leak hazard coming up, even if it isn't currently. What else? Electrical panels. If you see, there's breaker panels, and fuse panels. If you see a fuse panel in a house, they are still acceptable by code, but generally that means it's an old panel and the wiring in the home may not have been updated.
What does that look like? If you could describe.
So a fuse panel, a breaker panel, which you'd want to see is switches. In your main electrical panel, they're all switches that you could turn on and off. A fuse panel are all little round fuses. If you pull it out, it's kind of like a light bulb that's flat on top. You'd screw it out. It looks like the same threads as a light bulb. But on it, you're just going to see a bunch of circles and then a few squares that are cartridges for higher powered appliances. But yeah, if you see that, then you know you're looking at either early 80s or older for your electrical panel. And when you see a fuse panel as well, something you look for is aluminum wiring. This one can be a little more tricky to identify at a glance, but blue and silver sheathing on wiring around the electrical panel. So you'll see a bunch of wires coming out of the sides of the panel. And the sheathing is what's actually protecting it. So if you have, 2 or 3 wires in a cable, it's going to be wrapped in a sheathing. And aluminum wiring most commonly is blue or silver. So if you see that blue and silver, you don't know right away. You'll have to be able to read the description on it to know. But if you can see blue or silver and you're in a house that was built in the 70s, there's a darn good chance that's aluminum wiring.
Why is that a problem?
So aluminum in itself, if everything in your house was aluminum, that would be okay. The problem with aluminum in the 70s was when people started upgrading things later on, we're back to all copper wiring in homes now. Aluminum wire and copper wire are not compatible when they meet at a connection. So what people will do, where it's the most hazardous, is when people upgrade all of their receptacles, switches, light fixtures, with copper only receptacles and switches, they'll put those directly onto aluminum wire. So they'll connect them, they'll read the instructions, okay, this looks okay, even though somewhere in there it'll say only use copper wiring with this receptacle. Most people don't realize they're creating, 50 to 100 fire hazards. However many switches and receptacles you have in your home, everywhere you've connected a copper receptacle to aluminum wiring, you've created a fire hazard in the home. Yeah, so the big issue is now that things are being upgraded with copper wired fixtures and receptacles, you can't have that going directly onto aluminum wiring. So we see that all the time. People's painters will say, "Oh, I can upgrade all your receptacles. They're all these old yellow-looking receptacles. I'll put nice new white ones in there." So they buy a pack of 50 and they put them all in there. It's aluminum wiring, and the painter's not an electrician. He doesn't realize he just created a bunch of fire hazards in the home. So then you need an electrician to come through, and they do what's called pigtailing. They make a safe connection between the aluminum and the copper, which is what would need to be done in most aluminum wired
So
homes.
you can make a connection, but just
Yeah,
has
it's almost never that you have to actually replace the wiring, the aluminum wiring in the home. But yeah, pigtailing is what a licensed electrician would usually recommend. And yeah, what they're doing is inside the wall, they're making a safe connection between the aluminum and the copper wiring so that you'd see copper wire coming out of the wall. And then when people go to the store and they buy these new fixtures and switches, it's going to be compatible and not create fire hazards.
okay. And in terms of, I guess the two big ones are really electrical and plumbing.
Yeah.
What do you look for in terms of plumbing? Where are your eyes kind of drifting towards?
Plumbing is really difficult without running all the plumbing fixtures because I'm looking for leaks. That's first and foremost. I'm looking for leaks, so I will run every single plumbing fixture in the home. Showers and sinks I'll be running for 2 to 3 minutes. Toilets I'll flush at least twice. Looking for moisture stains around and below those items is what I'm looking for. But being able to check the plumbing and really look for things without seeing that is difficult. If you're in an old home, you'd be looking for galvanized pipes, which is an old steel type of piping that was known to corrode from the inside out. Insurance companies always want that replaced because it's an ongoing leak and flood hazard. But things like that, to the untrained eye, are pretty difficult to tell. If you're in a home and you see, like I said, really old bathroom fixtures, that would be a red flag to me. If you've got really old bathroom fixtures, they probably haven't done anything with the integral plumbing. And good copper pipes and plastic ABS drainage piping doesn't really need to be changed if a house was 40 years old. It's most of the time in good condition. But seeing those old plumbing fixtures is usually a red flag, even if they're in fairly good condition. It's the inner parts of those that start to crack and deteriorate and will cause leaks. And often leaks will happen inside the wall or leak inside the plumbing fixture down a wall, and then you've got water damage that can occur inside your walls and ceilings.
Now, a couple things I wanted to ask you about. There's just so much content out there with HGTV and all these kinds of shows where, they kind of take a sledgehammer and bust open a wall, and then there's this big kind of cliffhanger moment of, the violin screeching like, oh, we've got a problem here.
Yeah.
What would you say are the biggest kind of misconceptions or around what could be in a house that would be trouble for people to find? What do you think are some things that are way kind of overdone in the public's eye in terms of problems with a house?
Uh, do you mean that a home inspector would find during a home inspection, or things that people are like, "Whoa, this is a huge issue," and it's not that big of
Yes,
an issue?
the latter.
I mean, aluminum wiring, in a sense, is can be made perfectly safe. Some people are like, "Oh God, there's aluminum wiring. We need to walk away here." And there's two things with that. It's often a good bargaining tool with the clients or with the sellers. If they've done no maintenance on it, there's going to be some fire hazards in the house, and that'll need to be rectified.
How
Um,
cost effective, like how much does it cost to fix that, to pigtail all those?
um, the rule of thumb a few years ago was about $50 per junction. So that can add up, but 5 grand or something in a house to get those all done. Now, yeah, that was pre-pandemic. I should probably update those figures with an electrician, but so you might be looking at a little bit more than that now. But, if you're buying a $1 million house, it can usually be factored into that. And it's reasonable to be able to have that all repaired appropriately and make the house safe.
And you can negotiate down $5,000, especially in this market, quite easily.
Yeah, and
So
that's
worth
your
it.
expertise. That's where you guys take my information. But yeah, I would assume that wouldn't be a huge deal. If you can be like, yeah, these are potential fire hazards everywhere in the house. We need to get them done.
What other ones would you say are? Because and the reason why I'm asking is because you've been inspecting homes for how many years now?
Almost 10.
You've been inspecting homes for a decade. How many homes on average in a year do you inspect?
250 to 300.
Right. So you've inspected thousands of homes.
Yeah.
And where are the kind of where are those moments where you find something and you just see terror wash over a buyer's eyes and you have to kind of explain to them, hey, this is not that big a deal.
A lot of the time, foundation cracks. A lot, especially with new buyers, they've just heard, structural issues, foundation issues are the end. And it's very rare that I find a structural issue in the foundation that is going to be, $50,000, $100,000 remediation. It's almost always a crack that needs to be sealed, waterproofing done. It's a little bit like nowadays on a poured concrete foundation, which you'd find anywhere from the 70s till now, for about 500 max $1,000, you can have an injection seal done on almost any reasonable size crack, and have that waterproofed. And they'll usually give you a lifetime warranty on those.
And that's an epoxy injection.
Most of the time, an epoxy injection, yeah. So
And
they basically drill holes along the crack, they fill it with this epoxy, and almost all contractors now either give you a 10-year or a lifetime warranty on that crack seal.
that epoxy will expand and contract with the house over the seasons,
Yeah,
right?
epoxy is being used for a lot of things nowadays because it's like a semi-rigid type of material where if you use caulking, it's really soft and can deteriorate, and cement is so rigid that it will usually crack again. Epoxy has that slight flex where, yeah, it'll expand and contract with the foundation in different seasons and keep watertight in that crack. Yeah, it's got to be a really big crack for it to be, structural implications usually on a house. With block foundation, that's usually a lot easier to see, and there are more structural issues with block. It's just a lot weaker. And if you're not familiar, like a cinder block, the foundation made out of that as opposed to a whole poured concrete 8-foot wall is the difference in those. Yeah, the foundation block is a lot more likely for leak hazards as well, and still fairly rare for major structural concerns. But that, with an untrained eye, if you've got foundation blocks that are crooked, slanting, big gaps between them, you may be looking at a structural concern, and that's pretty easy to see with the untrained eye, even.
So cracks in the foundation, what would be other issues that you find that scare people more than they should be scaring people?
Um, the word mold. A lot of houses have at least a little bit of mold. Go in the attic, it should be mostly clean up there, but and mold can be remediated with fungicide, mold paint, mold removal techniques. It's very rare where I go into a home and I'm like, this is a major mold concern. Like there's been maybe 10 houses where I've ever said like, I wouldn't bring my family in this house because it's mold ridden. Like it's very rare to have issues like that. It's very common for me to go into an attic and there'd be, a big patch of mold in there where an exhaust fan from a bathroom is leaking air. It's just an air leak and it's been blowing that hot, humid air from showers onto the roof deck for 5 years. So now we got a big mold spot. That can be cleaned relatively cheap. And as soon as you stop that leak from happening, it's not going to continue to grow any more mold. That's definitely another big one, especially for people who haven't lived in homes and don't realize, every home's going to have some sort of leak or condensation issue at some point in time that will probably create some sort of water damage or mold issue that's usually manageable.
Talk to me a bit about asbestos, because that's another big
Well,
one.
that's a great one to bring up. That is something that people, when they're buying an old home, will almost always say, like, are you going to be looking for asbestos? How do you test for asbestos as you go through a home? Yeah, any home built prior to the 80s really could contain asbestos. It's usually 60s and before that where I do actually find more samples that could be asbestos. Most of the time, I can't tell for sure without sending off samples to a lab. Now, asbestos, like I've done a lot of classes, research, a ton of stuff on that, and people, it's got a way worse name than it needs for people living in homes with asbestos. If you have asbestos in your attic, which a lot of homes did in 40s and beyond, there was vermiculite insulation. If it's undisturbed and sitting in your attic, it is a zero health consequence. Almost nobody ever got sick living in a home that contained asbestos. It was always people mining, working in mines where they were like mining asbestos, or working in buildings where they were removing asbestos for several years. Those are the people who usually got sick from asbestos with lung problems, asbestosis, and stuff like that. It is very rare for somebody to live in a home and have issues from having asbestos in the home. That's definitely something that as I'm going through an older home, there's certain spots where I know, exterior siding. There's almost anything in an old home could have had a little bit of asbestos in it. Drywall, plaster, seams, insulation was a big one. I'll always, in an old home, open up a couple of the air ducts and check and see, because a lot of the times they were wrapped in asbestos. If an old home has a boiler system, like with radiator heating, often the boiler pipes were wrapped with an asbestos type insulation. The biggest place I see it for sure is in the attic with vermiculite insulation. And all of these things as well, you can have an asbestos removal company come in and remove that. It's more expensive than regular removal companies because it's considered an environmental hazard and health hazard, but it all can be removed as well. But generally, if it's sitting in your house in good condition and undisturbed, there's really no reason to have it removed.
Wow, that's a big
Yeah.
that's a big one
Yeah.
that people talk about. So
No, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, that's one all the time where it gets a yes, it's a significant health hazard if you're working with it, removing it. It's when it becomes, the term is called friable, when the microparticles can get into the air. It's usually when things are being torn apart or significantly deteriorating that happens. But even if you have a ceiling, a lot of ceiling tiles that are older may contain asbestos. If it's sitting there dry in good condition, there's no health hazard with that.
would you consider, I mean, because this has happened multiple times where I'm either selling a house or representing a buyer, buying a house, and we find asbestos. You know, the what if kind of questions come up. What if a rodent or raccoon gets into the attic and starts nesting up there? That's where kind of becomes a bit of a concern.
Yeah, funny thing is, I've never actually seen a big rodent issue in an attic with vermiculite. I'm not sure if there's a connection there. Rodents don't like living in it. I've never actually seen that. But I have seen people put fiberglass insulation on top of it and rodents through there. That's a pretty good question. Um, I'm not sure how to answer that one. That's a tough question. Yeah, animals could potentially get in there and disturb that, but there's no vents from your attic that make your way into a home. If you had, yeah, some homes that have been retrofit with air ducting may have their HVAC running through there, then for sure I would be recommending to have the vermiculite insulation removed. But other than that, most homes, the ceiling is sealed off with a vapor barrier too from the attic space. So even if an animal was in there and moved around some of that insulation, it really shouldn't cause any issues with the air in the home.
So let's say, you're buying an old home,
Mhm.
okay? And the home was built in the 60s, right? Like this, the house that we're in right now, it was
Yep.
probably built in the 60s, or the 70s. There might be vermiculite insulation in the attic. There might be some asbestos in that. Now, are you able to kind of just say, hey, look, it looks like it's undisturbed, but maybe there's not enough insulation in the attic and it's causing a bit of an efficiency problem with heating in the winter, and there's not enough insulation there. Can you just blow more insulation right over top of it, or just lay more insulation on top of it without removing it?
That's a tricky one too. The appropriate course of action would probably be to have it tested first. And that would be kind of a, some comments when I'm experiencing things like asbestos in an attic, because it is such a big fear of people. I'll have these blanket statements that I put in there that give them a lot of information about it. And the first one is, have it tested. I can't tell you if there's asbestos in there. Nobody can by looking at it. And it's, for a couple $100 to know if you've got asbestos in there or not, will give you peace of mind. When you're selling the house, you'll know if it's going to be an issue for buyers coming. You say, see, look at this. I got a lab certificate saying there's no asbestos in our vermiculite. And as well, I believe I have talked to an attic installer one time who wouldn't put insulation over top of vermiculite insulation unless it had been tested. So I see it all the time where insulation has been put on top. But I never, most of the time, unless there's a ticket there saying who installed the insulation, I don't know if it was the homeowner who did it or an attic installer. So I do see it all the time. I'll often, if it's sheets of fiberglass, lift them up in an old house to see if there's any vermiculite underneath. If it's blown in, I'll kind of move a little bit. But I don't know if it's not allowed or not. I'm not sure if there's any rules against it particularly.
Now, one thing I wanted to kind of ask you in particular is because I find when I'm representing home buyers in particular that the process itself already is just such a stressful process that there's just this overall heightened state of anxiety, stress, which makes little problems seem like big problems,
Yeah.
no matter how small the problem. Genuinely, though, there are big problems that do come up. Where, in your experience, when has it happened where you've seen something that was so bad where, I'm sure it's happened a number of times where you turned to a buyer and you said, walk away from this thing?
Uh, yeah, a couple of those times have been mold-ridden homes. Those are usually really old homes. Um,
How old?
uh, 60 to 100 years old. A few that are in the back of my mind are homes that were built. I'm up in Keswick, is where I'm located in. There's a lot of old cottages that people are now living in as four-season homes. There's quite a few of them that were built without eaves troughs, and they're wood siding homes. So for 90 years, they've had water draining either down the sides of the homes or near the homes. And a lot of those, the wood walls are rotted out, and there's mold almost everywhere wrapped around the insides of those houses. So something like that, I had a client who's like, well, what would it cost just to repair all of this? And I'm like, well, we can see there's mold and water damage around the inside of the entire house. I'm like, so there's water damage in all of your exterior structure. I'm like, do you want to repair all of your exterior walls or just start from scratch? Which would make more sense. So, if you're spending a few $100,000 um, at least to rebuild your exterior walls, even on a one floor bungalow that's made out of wood, it's not really worth it to start on a wood damaged house already. So it's like they had no idea. The guy thought he was going to paint the place and rent it out. And I literally told him, like, I wouldn't let my daughter walk into this house. Like, it's as soon as I walked in here, it just reeks of mold and mildew. And that is a significant health hazard.
What can happen to being exposed or living in a house like that? Like, what are the actual health risks?
Most
What
often, lung diseases. There's certain types of mold that can cause brain diseases and defects. Um, Usually black molds and over prolonged periods. There's a couple places where it's been very worrying for me after I've inspected a home, and the sellers have told me, oh, like it's there's some mold in the house, but it's not a big deal. My parents lived here for 30 years, and their parents had both passed away, and I'm like, well, did that have anything? Like I've never asked them, but it's like that could certainly have an effect on you over 30 years living in a mold-ridden house. Like that can have major effects. One of them, I went in there and the man was on a ventilator with an oxygen tank he was carrying around, and they didn't put together at all that there could have been some relation. And I don't know if there was. I didn't actually know what his illness was, but in my head, that's the first thing that I think of. I'm like, is the mold in the house causing any illnesses in here?
Right.
If you have a couple spots of mold, that's really not going to affect your health long term. If you're hypersensitive to that sort of stuff, it might. I feel bad for people. I do mold testing too, and I've seen a few people who are renting and their landlords aren't keeping up with things and they've got leaks. that are causing mold. And they're like, yeah, my kid's nose have been running for months on end, and like they just always have a cold, and it's almost certainly because of the mold in the house. So it can cause some pretty serious health effects. But those are major mold issues, which is pretty rare. I find them, but it's pretty rare to have something that significant in a home.
Now, I need to ask you just because it just makes for great content, but what are the worst horror stories that you've ever seen personally?
Um, I have seen I've seen some aluminum houses with multiple receptacles that have smoke coming out of them, um, and like scorch marks all over them because they've had people put copper receptacles on aluminum wiring with no electrical knowledge. The mold-ridden houses are some of the like it's rare that I would ever tell a client this is one you should walk away from. It's really not my opinion to say. Some people are perfectly fine putting 300 grand into a house, and other people don't want to put a dime into a house. So the house can be right for any person, no matter what's wrong with it. But yeah, major mold issues that people aren't aware of is one of the bigger deal breakers that I see. Um, there was a lot of these worse houses I got were during the pandemic when I was doing post-purchase inspections after people had the keys and they're like, what did I buy here? One of them, again, was an older home in a more cottagey neighborhood, built probably 80 years ago with almost no building code. And the guy literally thought it was a sloping roof, and it was a straight part of the ridge the house had sunk in 12 inches into the ground because there was no actual foundation. It was wood straight into mud. And the back of the house had sunk in 12 inches. That one also was mold ridden, needed a new septic and well. And that was basically a rebuild. And again, he was like, well, what's going to cost for these things? And he thought he had been swindled, but I looked at the deal after. He basically paid land value for it. It was like an acre of land across the street from the lake that he paid like 300 grand in the middle of the pandemic for. And I'm like, nobody might have told you that this is a teardown, but they didn't represent it as a move-in ready house. So you really got to know, and that's where having a good agent, like, I don't expect the agents to know everything to know if this house is a tear down, but there's some things where I know you would walk around a house like that and just be like, I cannot let you buy this house without a home inspection. And that was one of them where I'm like, any real estate agent should be able to walk around this house and say 10 red flags here. Like the client was new to the country and he just wasn't familiar with a lot of things. There was mold around the baseboards and he was wondering, he's like, what's this stain here? I'm like, that's mold because there's been water damage everywhere in the house. There's no foundation. There's the whole bottom of the house was covered in mold. It had a number of different issues. But yeah, that one was frightening, especially again because he thought he was getting a house that he was just gonna he hadn't decided if he was going to move his family in there or rent it out yet, but he thought he had a few things he needed to do. And I'm like, this is like hundreds of thousands, if not just a tear down.
Now, it is rare that, you know, you come in and then me and you are both kind of looking at the client going, like walk away from this deal.
Yeah.
It's rare, but it has happened a few times with me and
Yeah,
you.
I'm trying to
And
think. What was the one you were telling me the other day about?
so there was one that was an absolute horror story that happened, and it just so happened that we like, you know, my I was representing the buyer, and we had walked into this house and asked you to come and do an inspection when we had it conditional, uh, and the deal was in place, but we hadn't firmed up on it yet. And then you showed up and said, I've been here before.
Oh, yes. Okay.
So
I don't know why I keep forgetting this story, but
what
yeah,
happened?
that was an interesting story. That was a unique one that I've never had done happen before. I have inspected homes multiple times, not too often, but when the market's busy or several years pass, a new buyer comes in. But this one, a house that had trouble selling, um, and the agent who was selling the house called me to come in and do a pre-list inspection. I think a couple buyers had an agent inspectors come through and turn the house down.
So before she listed it, she said, I want a pre-listing inspection done so that we can represent the home.
Yeah, I think it had been listed, but we still call it a pre-list inspection if it's done for the sellers before it's been sold.
Okay, so the seller hired you to do an inspection.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So I went through, it was an old house, but it had been completely renovated inside. And that to me, on an old house, means absolutely nothing. Sometimes it's a lot more work for me. I'll have buyers call me sometimes, and thankfully they have real estate agents. They'll be like, I don't think I need a home inspection. The place is brand new inside. It looks great, but my agent said I should get one. And I'm like, okay, well, yeah, you definitely should, because what those renovations do, they look fantastic. And I don't really care about any of the finishing touches on a house. I'm looking at the bones and what's everything I can find out underlying conditions of the home. So I went through there and it
So
was
hold on, just to be clear, when you see a home that's been renovated, the cosmetics to you mean absolutely nothing. The home could look
absolutely nothing.
right, and this is where people get caught up because they see it, it looks amazing, it's kind of, the brand new shiny object kind of feel.
Yeah.
You smell the paint in the house when you walk through, you smell the new hardwood floors, and you think to yourself, the work has been done for me. And you're saying that is not the case.
It makes my job harder because it covers up all the things I want to get a look at. Things as simple as a water stain in the ceiling. The popcorn ceiling's probably been stripped and painted over. There may still be a leak there, but if it was painted a month ago and we're in a dry spell in the summer, I may have no idea that there's an active leak there. So it makes the job very much harder for a home inspector. And again, up in Keswick, where there's homes that are 150 years old to new homes, when I'm in those older homes, they've all been renovated by now, or a lot of them have been. So I know a lot of them weren't very well built, and now the renovations have covered up a lot of the things that I'd like to get my hands on and see at least. So yeah, that doesn't mean too much when it's been renovated. And again, because it's cottage country, we're kind of on the edge. People don't know where Keswick is, it's basically the start of the end of the GTA and the start of cottage country, right at the end of the 404.
Right, Simcoe.
Yeah. So that's where you start getting some sketchy contractors as well. Guys who have renovated the whole house when they're not a licensed plumber, they're not a licensed electrician. A lot of stuff is done not with proper licenses, and there's just these little things or big things done all over the place that don't add up. And if I see one outlet that's been wired incorrectly, that's not an issue at all. But when it's 15 of them in the house, I'm like, okay, I found 15, maybe I missed 3, and else is behind the walls that wasn't done properly when I start seeing stuff like that.
So this happened. So
Oh yeah.
we were representing some clients, and this exact kind of thing happened. Brand new renovation on the inside, and what had happened with this place?
Yeah, so the inside, and this is a pretty classic, I don't know if it's a trick. People will build bathrooms around an electrical panel. One of the number one rules of electrical installation is you can't put the electrical panel inside a bathroom. It technically can be somewhere with like a powder room without a shower, but if it has a shower, it's not allowed to be in there because you're just creating a hot, humid room, often multiple times a day. That doesn't go with electrical. It'll create corrosion on the entire panel. But what happens in older homes is people will build the bathroom around the electrical panel. It's usually an open space, that nice spot. Oh, we could throw a bathroom in here. It's perfect. But they'll leave the electrical panel in place. So that's something that'll now need to be moved. And instead of doing it before, it's going to cost a lot more money, and it's a lot more expensive than you'd think to move a panel. It's a lot more expensive than just replacing a panel, because you have to move everything in the house, all of those connections to a new spot. So that was one thing we found inside that house. A major thing, the electrical service coming in, it came in from the driveway, and inside the basement you could see the wire running along the basement floor to the panel, and the conduit which protects the wires had fully rusted through. Water had been draining down that conduit right along the electrical wires for several years. So in the basement, I could see this exposed service. So that's your 100 amp service, or 200, I'm not sure what that house was, coming into the house, and it's just got water pooling around it.
Just so people are aware and understand what the service entrance cable is. Explain a bit about what that is.
All of the power to your house comes through the service entrance. So 100 amps. If you touch a 100 amp wire, you're basically going to get electrocuted and die if you come in contact with that. So it wasn't wet when I was at the inspection, but all of this rust and moisture stains, I could tell that was what happened. Right. They had sealed the outside at some point and stopped water from coming in currently. So that's one thing I red flagged on my pre-list inspection, I'm like, this needs an electrician to come in and repair or replace the service conduit and service wires as needed to make it safe. I never know. I'm not a licensed electrician, so I don't know exactly what needs to be done to make it safe. But there's very significant hazards, especially because in the basement here, it was half a crawl space where if you were there's people use that as storage space. Somebody crawled through there, a kid playing a game, and touched that wire, they would get electrocuted. So I'm like,
and we're not talking about any like small amount of electrocution. We're talking
oh,
about
this is
basically
as much power as goes into an entire house at one time. If you touched it, you'd
we're
get going
talking
through your
about
body.
we're basically talking about basically certain death.
Yeah, very, very high likelihood of death.
Okay.
Hospitalization or death is almost a certainty.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
So that's what I said. Like that was one of the most immediate dangerous things I've seen in an inspection is that much power. Any live wire can kill a person.
Right.
If you take a switch off a wall and it's live wire, a lot of the times you'll just get a shock and it'll wake you up. But that is enough electricity to kill a person.
Right.
But this for sure it's 100 amps of electricity at the bare minimum. So this house, there were numerous other issues. There were things hidden, issues with other electrical outlets that have been done wrong. Like it was very clear a lot of things have been done not by professionals. Plumbing systems where they moved sinks and the sinks are now not properly vented, so they either drain slowly or you smell sewer gas coming out of them.
Oh.
A lot of things like that. To the untrained eye, this is a brand new sink. There's brand new plumbing underneath. This is great, but it's pretty easy to mess up plumbing if you don't know what you're doing as well. But yeah, this one here. So I was almost certain they were going to fix a lot of these issues, which that's with a pre-list inspection. You either basically take that inspection report and fix up the major issues there so that they're not going to be an issue for the buyers, or you just fully disclose them. Nobody has to fix anything I say in a pre-list inspection that I do for the sellers, but if it's something that dangerous, they are legally required to disclose that to buyers if they're going to sell it in that condition.
Right, that's a material latent defect.
Yes.
Okay.
So,
and just to clear that up, a material latent defect is something that the seller knows is wrong with the house that you can't readily see.
Yeah.
And this is a material latent defect is something they absolutely have to disclose.
Yeah, and this is something, most buyers aren't going to crawl through the crawl space and look for exposed electrical wires. So
correct.
The buyer's not going to see that.
Okay.
But this has now been found, brought to their attention, and anyone with a good conscience, forget a real estate deal. Like, I don't know how, like with a good conscience, you could then have other people come through the house and not know about this issue.
But they didn't do anything, did
they? They didn't do anything, no. So there was, I remember there were other spliced wires on the outside of the house, which were almost as big of shock hazards and electrical concerns, but those ones are easier to fix. Some of them get covered up with tape and things like that, not properly done it. But when I went back and went in the basement, what they had done is spray painted this entire conduit and the cables inside black. So instead of having an electrician in to fix it and make it safe, they concealed it up. So it's still the same hazard. It was more of a hazard because now it doesn't look like this electrical conduit. It was in the dark in a shadow. You can't even see the thing. So that was one of the more frightening and worrisome things that I've ever seen a seller do from a pre-list. And then I went in with the buyers, which was Adam's client. And when I see that they've covered up, again, I go through and I'm going to find a number of these issues and a lot of the things they didn't do or tried to cover up in an unprofessional way. What else am I missing? What else did they cover up that I now can't see?
So now this is kind of interesting because you were hired by the sellers to do an inspection.
Yeah.
You did the inspection. You found some really nasty stuff. You told them about it. You filed a report that says here it is.
Yeah.
Then months later, or weeks later, however much time it was, I give you a call and say, hey, my clients found a place that they liked. We'd like you to come inspect it. Now you're being hired by the buyers, and you come in and see that not only are the problems still there, but you've actually now had positive proof that there is now nefarious behavior involved in concealing these, deathly hazardous, situations. That
exactly. And that's where, with a new renovation, sometimes they're just bad renos. People aren't purposefully trying to make things like cover up issues. A lot of the times that's the case. It's people who want to do things a little cheaper. They're doing a lot of the stuff themselves. It's not all done perfectly. But yeah, this made things worse, and they purposefully were covering issues up, and it was very obvious. And that's some time where it's very easy on my part, which I rarely, like I said, will say you should not buy this house. That's a time where it's very easy to say that, you
So
know.
what would you, I guess, advise if, let's rewind the clock. We're back in 2021. No one's doing home inspections. Everyone's buying things in a frantic kind of panic frenzy. Um, you know, if those people, if you could rewind the clock and kind of give them a few words of wisdom of like, check this out, look for this, if they're not able to bring you in there, because Lord knows with Toronto and the Toronto real estate market, give it a couple of years, we'll probably be back there in this crazy frenzy again eventually. What would you tell those people to look out for if they're not able to get a home inspection?
That I is really tough to help out with, because yeah, the like I said, some of the stuff is obvious to me and to most real estate agents, but some of it's not. Like a house that's sunken 12 inches. It wasn't just the outside. When I went inside of that house, you could tell the wall was like this. And it's just like these are red flags that are very obvious to see. Um, you do need some sort of experience to do that. Being a first-time buyer going into a home with no experience, not even having been through a home inspection before is
It's not even really first time buyers though, is it? Because
no.
you can have bought a house 3 times over 20 years and you're not gonna know.
That's true. I'll usually ask at the beginning of inspection if somebody's a first-time buyer, because that might mean they have no experience with the systems of a home. But there are a lot of people who have owned homes their whole lives and still don't know too much about a home. They pay people to come in and replace a filter here and a filter there and that sort of stuff, and that's perfectly fine. But yeah, a lot of the times they have no idea what I'm looking at or even what I'm talking about when I'm going through a house. So they're like, "Oh no, like I don't really know what this is. Can you explain that further?" Yeah, so it's first time buyers or not. It's hard for me because my advice, and I know I'm biased on it, is like it's almost crazy to buy a house without a home inspection. If you are not familiar with building a house yourself, if you don't have at least, a friend or family member who's in construction and knows the stuff really well, it's hard to walk through a house in 30 minutes and tell much to a person about the house.
Mm.
And we were doing that for a bit. We really try not to do property walkthroughs, we call them, where when people are in that panic and they want to put in an offer, and they only have 30 minutes to go through a home, and the sellers won't allow a full home inspection, going in and picking out the major systems in a home. But there's so much liability with that. We have our clients sign a liability waiver releasing us of everything, saying does not constitute a home inspection in any way, shape, or form. This is an informative walk and talk through the property. And that's just where we can point out obvious things. I can't tell you if your HVAC system is working properly, but I can tell you it's a 4-year-old furnace or a 40-year-old furnace. So, those things you can get some information from, but I don't have time to test your furnace and your air conditioner and see if the ducts are working properly and that sort of stuff. So, a lot of people are like, well, can't you just test the HVAC system? Well, all the systems overlap, and our insurance doesn't let us test those things individually. We have to test as per our standards of practice, or we don't meet our inspection standards and our insurance doesn't cover us. So that's where a lot of people are like, well, can't you just inspect this for me? Can't you just inspect that for me? The HVAC system can cause issues other places in the house. Like your air ducts, if they have certain issues, they can create a full-on condensation leak and create a big mold issue inside your basement ceiling. I've seen that before several times. So now I could say, yeah, your furnace is working, but it's causing this. I can't tell you that it's causing this giant mold issue in your house. So that's where the legal issues come in. We're meant to assess a home as an entire system, not just one system, because they all overlap.
And there are so many issues that are not big deals that seem like they are big deals. There are so many things that don't seem like big deals that are big deals,
Yeah.
and you really can't assess it for yourself. Like you really have to have a professional come through and tell you what's what.
Yeah.
Or
And that's where, you know, you can go through a home and if you see a moisture stain in the ceiling, what does that tell you? Um,
Nothing.
right. It's really hard to tell you. I mean, how old's the home? If it's a 1-year-old home, something happened recently. If it's a 50-year-old home, that could have happened 50 years ago. Is there plumbing above there? Is your roof above there? Like people don't even realize there's big moisture stains in ceilings from mice sometimes. There's no leak, there's no condensation issue. It's mice going to the bathroom in a ceiling. And they're like, oh, there must be a leak here. Like they just had the roof replaced. I got to get my roofer back. I'm like, no, you got a mouse issue in the house. Well, these are things that you can't tell without, like, if I went into the attic and I saw, you know, the insulation's all been moved around by squirrels or mice or raccoons. Okay, that might be causing this issue and not a roof leak.
Right. Or like people see condensation in a window.
Yeah.
That can be a big deal, can also not be a big deal.
Yeah, condensation in a window is a tough one for a home inspector. That can be a number of things. It could be not enough insulation around your window. It could be a low thermal efficiency window. It could be too much humidity in the home. It could be a localized humidity issue in the home. There's a number of things that can cause that as well.
Or it's the old double pane window where the argon gas between the two panes has escaped.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of things to really be considering, and there's only one way to know for sure.
Yeah.
Thank God now we're back in. I wouldn't call this a normal market. This is for sure still
Yeah.
a very suppressed marketplace,
Yeah.
but at least it's something where I can almost guarantee most of my clients that we can get you in to take a look at something.
Yeah. And that, yeah, the market is much better now. I mean, I would never, for a real estate standpoint, say don't buy a house on any circumstance if you can't get a home inspection done. But that was the only time where I was doing those pre-lists. Like I had, I think in the span of 3 months, 3 houses that I would consider teardowns. And that is like out of like, yeah, 10 teardowns in 10 years, three of them were in 3 months. And it's all because people are buying these houses with no conditions. And sellers were taking major advantage of that. You know, if you can get rid of this house now, do it because if we get back into a market with home inspections, it can bring the price of this house down, you know, a few $100,000.
Mm. So I guess back to my original question, it would be I can't really give you anything other than just get a home inspection because if you don't,
Yeah, there can
all
be
that.
there's so many issues. Like we are basically a jack of all trades and a master of none. I mean, there's a lot of things that over time you get to feel almost like an expert in, but I tell people all the time, they're like, so what exactly needs to be done to fix this electrical issue? And I say, well, I'm not a licensed electrician. Like electrical's probably my strongest suit. My brother's an electrician. I've asked him every question in the book in the last 10 years. But I'm like, I can't give you the proper repair to this. And there's no point in us speculating about it either. An electrician has to come in and assess this. And there's just going to be so many things in a house where if you're trying to walk through a house in 20 minutes and get an estimate on what the repairs would be, like there's just too many things that you could be missing.
Interesting. Well, I think that hammered home a really good point where, I with an experienced home inspector sitting here with me, I couldn't even get hey, watch out for these few things. It's always just don't chance it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I could qualify, which still doesn't go for all homes, if you're buying a home built 80s is okay, 90s and newer, there are an infinite amount less issues in homes built in the 90s and afterwards.
Wow. So your I guess one takeaway from this would be if you're buying a home that was built in the 80s and
Like
onwards.
1980 and older, for sure. I think it's almost crazy buying a home older than that with no home inspection.
Really?
Yeah.
So when did the Ontario Building Code really change in
I
your
don't know the exact year. I think in 19 either late 70s or early 80s. Because the 70s there was a whole bunch of unintended consequences that happened. Like the price of copper went through the roof, which is why you see aluminum wire in the 70s. Through the 70s, aluminum was so much cheaper they were being installed. I didn't really realize until people started using copper again on homes that when they come in contact, they separate because they expand at different rates. Now we got fire hazards everywhere, so we shouldn't be putting aluminum wire into the homes when there's copper. And there was copper in homes in the 60s and now copper in homes in the 80s. So it's that span of the 70s was the problem. They also in this end of the 70s started starting to make homes a lot more airtight. which was a good thing. But what they didn't realize is if you tighten up a house and it doesn't have enough insulation, you're going to create a lot of mold issues. So those are the two number one things I'm looking at a house in the 70s. I know built in the 70s, okay, looking for aluminum issues, looking for condensation and mold issues. Like the attic is number one for mold in the 70s. And it's not every house. It's maybe like 40%, 50% of the houses, but that's kind of a lot. Um, they started making them more airtight. They didn't have enough ventilation in the attic space anymore. In the 70s, they still only had 6 or 8 inches of insulation. So you get all that hot air through the house goes and hits the roof and turns into mold because it condenses, turns into condensation, and over time on that wood it'll turn to mold. So they realize, okay, if we're doing that, we need to increase the insulation as well. So now homes are, since the end of the 80s, mid 80s, are much more efficient and airtight. So the insulation's been increased. They've been sealed up and airtight because before, even without the insulation, houses were so breathable. Things weren't, windows weren't airtight and stuff, doors weren't airtight. It would release a lot of that condensation out.
Now, I guess I hear a lot of the old saying, they don't build them like they used to. Is there any credence to that?
It's a big yes and no. Um, if they took the best parts of 100-year-old homes and put them into new homes, it would be great. But a new home nowadays beats an old house almost every day of the week on the build. As far as like efficiency and all the hazards, like fire hazards is the biggest one. People don't believe me almost of the time with electrical hazards that I find in older homes with knob and tube wiring, ungrounded wiring, aluminum wiring. Houses burn down, and they burnt down a lot, and they still do actually. Like I was in a neighborhood 2 weeks ago, and it was a townhouse neighborhood, and they all had aluminum wiring, and one of the houses had burnt down across the street. It was an identical build. And the buyers were like, should we be worried about anything if their house burnt down? And we went in, and I'm like, well, this has aluminum wiring, so I'd want to have an ESA certificate on this to make sure everything's been safely done. Because if not, that's a pretty big fire hazard in the house. And people don't really realize that things are serious hazards. And I get some agents who are like, oh, well, that's not really a big deal. Like that doesn't happen. Nobody falls through a deck. Like I'm like, it does happen. And that's why these safety codes are in place. And it's the home inspectors, agents, you guys go through a lot of homes. You go through a lot of homes pretty quickly if you're showing homes. Like I've gone through, like you said, thousands of homes with a fine-tooth comb. And I see these things and repercussions of them and why this has happened and what's happened and the reasons, something, it might be a $50 fix to an outlet, but it can burn down a whole house.
Interesting. Wow. Well, what I plan to do with this conversation is to post it and to kind of give people a little bit more background, especially walking into the process of searching for a home, looking to buy a home, understanding what the potential risks are. Because once that deal is firm, I mean, you're kind of cooked, right? Like that's you're
Yeah. And
right.
one thing I would say, like, I know, like, a lot of what I've said, some things might sound a little scary, like, oh my God, like, all this stuff. Most things are pretty manageable if they're properly maintained. And most, even things that are a little bit bigger, like a leak hazard, a leak in your basement, most things are manageable. And that's what I try and tell the clients, like, oh yeah, there's an active leak here, but you know what? This isn't the end. Like, I'll often say, is a few $1,000s is usually your worst case on a leak, unless you're flooded your basement.
Out of all the homes that you've walked through, just to kind of get an idea, because you do inspections in the areas that I work in York region mostly, and that's mostly where I work.
Yeah.
Um, you know, if you were a buyer, out of all the homes you've walked through in York region, what percentage of them would you say you would walk away from having done thousands
Oh,
of inspections?
1% or less.
Okay, so we're talking
And
about
that would have to be qualified with what builders or buyers are prepared on. There's some that I would walk away, and some people are still perfectly happy to buy.
right, of course. It's
And that's where, yeah, like people are like, would you buy this home? That's one of the most common questions I get asked.
right.
And it's like, well, okay, I don't have $200,000 to renovate it, but you told me that's your plan when moving in here. So no, I wouldn't buy it, but this could be a very good home for you because $200,000, I'd be like, you can make this place incredible. You can
Right.
fix all the issues and have money for like just luxury renovations after that.
So in your region in general, Richmond Hill, Vaughan, like these kinds of areas, for the most part.
For the most part, there's a lot of newer neighborhoods. All of them have old neighborhoods as well. But yeah, those home like Markham, Richmond Hill, I like doing inspections in there a lot of the time because there's a lot of all those new neighborhoods as it's expanding out. They're all newer. Like I said, if you're buying a home built after the 80s, most of the time, there's just certain things like your plumbing is going to be a certain standard. Your wiring in your house is all copper wiring. You get at all those old band materials that are in homes that might still be in an old home. So that's where, yeah, some of those communities have a lot newer homes, but there's tons of, you go to Unionville and Markham, there's tons of old homes in there. Um, all the rural areas, old homes in those parts too.
Now, just so that everybody understands when they're listening to this, you don't inspect wells, septic systems, tanks, things like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, a lot of people think that, oh, that's a big part of the house. We should be doing that. There are a few home inspectors that do septic and well, but that is a full separate license. And it's not like a day course. You need like hundreds and hundreds of hours experience with septic and wells to get that certification, that license to do it. So yeah, we inspect if the house has septic and well, I'll inspect all of the plumbing inside the house. But it basically stops where it goes out the walls out to the septic and well.
Now, where can people find you? How do they get a hold of you?
They can, if Adam can pass them my business card, that'd be number one. No, we are the Martiniuk team, which is tough to spell. We might have to post something. Yeah, we're Pillar to Post, the Martiniuk team. We cover all of York region. If you go onto Google and type in Pillar to Post and the city that you're buying in, we should come up. There are a couple other Pillar to Post guys in our area. Um, but that's usually the easiest way. Pillar to Post home inspectors on Google and the city you're looking in.
Wonderful thing also to note and mention that one thing that I love about what you do is when you finish a home inspection, you give your clients a full binder with a whole bunch of useful stuff in there. And part of that stuff is a cost estimate guide that has I mean, the list is so extensive of everything that you could ever need to replace or repair in your home and a rough estimate of how much it should cost you. Things like per square footage
Yeah.
for flooring even. I mean, there was so much in there. And one thing that I wanted to thank you so much for is you actually provided that to me. I'm putting together an ultimate kind of homeowner's guide type of thing for all of my clients and people out there. And I'm going to be including that. And you've been a wonderful resource in providing a lot of that stuff to me so that I can
Awesome.
include it in there for people. So I wanted to thank you so much for doing that because that is like a
No
huge
problem.
help. So thanks for coming in today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's been a blast. I'm excited to get this one out because I know that anyone who is looking to start searching for a home, this is the conversation you want to hear. This is what you need to hear is listen to this man. Listen to Kyle. He is the goat when it comes to doing inspections on a home and looking under the rug, looking behind the curtain and seeing what's actually happening with a house that you're going to be spending hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars on. This is the guy you want to speak to. So thanks so much for
I
coming in.
appreciate all of that very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, follow, and give us a review.